The Malacca Strait. Dawn, 1942. The sea is still, a blue-black mirror stretching to the southern horizon. On the bridge of a Japanese destroyer, Lieutenant Saito steadies his binoculars. He's 26, a rising star in naval gunnery, a man who's memorized every firing table the Imperial Japanese Navy has ever printed. He tracks a lone silhouette, moving with slow, deliberate confidence. British, Queen Elizabeth class, old, upgraded, still dangerous, but not at this distance. He checks the range, 19 miles, far beyond effective range. His muscles relax. "We're safe," he reports to the captain. Then the horizon blinks. A flash. Brilliant. Sharp. Unmistakable. He counts. 1,000. 2 1,000. 3 1,000. 30 seconds. 35. Then the sea beside them explodes. A towering column of water, white, vast, violent, slams into their hull. The destroyer rocks hard. Metal screams. Another column erupts astern. Another closer. Too close. Saito's voice cracks as he whispers the question that has haunted sailors across 2 world wars. "What kind of gun is that?" The British BL 15-inch Mark I naval gun, designed in 1912, fired in anger since 1915, the most successful heavy naval gun of the First World War, and somehow impossibly still lethal in the Second. 15-inch bore diameter. Shell weight, 138 pounds, nearly a ton of high-explosive steel travelling at supersonic speeds. Maximum range, over 30,000 yards. That's 17 miles. But with radar-assisted fire control and upgraded shells, the British were landing hits at distances that rewrote the rulebook. This wasn't the biggest naval gun. It wasn't the newest. But it hit consistently. At ranges where mathematics said it shouldn't, and for decades that terrified anyone who found themselves on the receiving end. The Japanese Navy respected many things about the Royal Navy: its traditions, its tactics, its lineage. But this weapon, this was something different, something maddening, something that didn't just sink ships, it rewrote how navies calculated risk. Because the BL 15-inch didn't just create physical range, it created psychological range. A zone of control that stretched far beyond what you could see, far beyond what you thought was possible, forcing enemy commanders to second-guess, to hesitate, to retreat before the battle even began. If you want to see how one gun changed naval warfare across 2 world wars, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I want to know if there are any naval history fans out there who've heard this story before. But to understand why the British 15-inch gun horrified the Japanese Navy, why experienced officers like Lieutenant Saito felt their confidence shatter in 35 seconds, we have to go back. Back to 1916, to the grey, cold waters of the North Sea, to a battle that changed everything. Jutland, Portsmouth, England, 1912. The British Admiralty faced a problem. Germany was building dreadnoughts faster than anyone had predicted. The naval arms race was accelerating, and Britain's existing 13.5-inch guns, while excellent, weren't enough to guarantee the margin of superiority the Royal Navy demanded. They needed something bigger. But bigger wasn't simple. Larger naval guns meant heavier turrets, thicker armour, more stress on hulls. They meant longer barrels that whipped and flexed during firing, scattering shells across the ocean. They meant wear patterns that could render a gun useless after a few dozen shots. Every navy that had tried to scale up had discovered the same brutal truth. Making a gun larger was easy. Making it accurate was nearly impossible. The British approach was different. While other navies chased raw power, British engineers obsessed over consistency. They studied barrel harmonics, the way steel vibrated during firing. They refined propellant chemistry, looking for burns that produced steady, predictable pressure curves. They tested cooling systems, recoil mechanisms, mounting configurations. They asked a simple question: what good is a shell that travels 20 miles if you can't predict where it lands? The BL 15-inch Mark I was born from that philosophy. 15 inches of bore diameter, 42 calibers long, a wire-wound construction that distributed stress evenly across the barrel. Each gun weighed over 100 tons, but it was the balance that mattered. The weapon had been engineered not for maximum range, but for maximum repeatability. When the first prototypes arrived at the proof and experimental establishment in Shoeburyness, even the designers were nervous. This was a leap. a gamble. No one had built a gun this large with this level of precision engineering before. The first trials began in early 1913. The gun fired. The shell landed exactly where the firing tables predicted. It fired again. The grouping held again. By the 10th shot, the observers were silent. By the 20th, they were stunned. The 15-inch wasn't just accurate, it was reliably accurate. Shot after shot, the shells landed in a pattern so tight it defied what anyone thought possible for a weapon this size. The barrel didn't whip. The recoil system absorbed shock without degrading aim. The propellant burned clean and consistent. The rifling held its shape even after repeated firings. One senior gunnery officer wrote in his report, "This weapon performs as if it were half its size." By 1915, the 15-inch guns were mounted on the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, 5 ships that would anchor British naval power for decades. And when those ships entered combat, the gun's reputation grew with every salvo. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't revolutionary in concept, but it worked. Every time, at distances that made enemy commanders recalculate their entire approach to naval engagement. Tokyo, 1917. In the offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Technical Department, a translated British gunnery, report landed on the desk of Commander Nakamura. He read it carefully. Then he read it again. Japan and Britain were allies during the First World War. Information flowed freely. Japanese naval attachés attended British trials, observed Royal Navy exercises, studied their methods with meticulous attention, and what they saw disturbed them. The British 15-inch gun was hitting targets at 18,000 yards, over 10 miles, with a consistency that Japanese guns simply couldn't match. Not yet. Japan's own 14-inch guns were powerful, modern, well-designed, but they lacked the precision. The groupings were wider, the trajectories less predictable. Commander Nakamura filed his report quietly. The British have achieved something unusual. Further study required. Japanese observers attended more trials in the 1920s. They watched British crews train on aging Queen Elizabeth-class ships, watched them fire thousands of practice rounds, watched them refine fire control methods year after year. The British weren't standing still. They were iterating, improving, evolving the weapon system even as it aged. One attaché wrote home, "They treat gunnery as a science, not an art." The Japanese Navy respected this deeply. The Royal Navy's professionalism, its discipline, its relentless focus on incremental improvement, these were qualities Japan admired and sought to emulate. But respect is not fear. In the 1920s and 1930s, as Japan designed its own super battleships, the 15-inch gun was viewed as a benchmark. Impressive, yes, but not insurmountable. Japan's new 16-inch and 18-inch guns would be larger, more powerful, more devastating. The British weapon was old, a relic of the last war. Dangerous, certainly, but not terrifying. Not yet. That would come later, when the mathematics of war collided with the reality of battle, and Japanese officers like Lieutenant Saito discovered that some weapons refused to age. Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, Etajima, 1917. The instructors spread maps across the table. North Sea, May 21st, 1916. Jutland, the largest naval battle of the Great War. Every cadet in the room had memorized the basic facts. 250 ships, 100,000 men, an inconclusive tactical result, but a strategic British victory. But the Japanese Navy wasn't interested in tactics or strategy. They wanted to understand the gunnery. Commander Tanaka pointed to a notation on the chart. HMS Barham, firing at SMS Seydlitz. Range, 19,000 yards, nearly 11 miles. A 15-inch shell had struck the German battlecruiser's armour belt, penetrated, detonated deep inside the hull. At this distance, Tanaka said slowly, the shell arrives at a steep angle. Plunging fire. It should skip off the deck armour or tumble on impact. The Germans built their ships expecting this. He paused. The shell did not skip. It did not tumble. It punched through. The room was silent. Another example. HMS Warspite, engaging SMS Derflinger. Range, 20,000 yards, multiple hits, clean penetrations. The German ship survived barely, but the damage was catastrophic. Not from lucky shots, but from shells that performed exactly as designed at distances the Germans had assumed were safe. The Japanese analysts pored over captured German reports, British after-action summaries, even salvaged shell fragments. They built models, they ran calculations, they cross-referenced trajectory tables with damage assessments, and one conclusion kept surfacing. Undeniable and troubling. The British 15-inch gun hit at extreme range, not occasionally, but systematically. This wasn't luck. This was engineering translated into lethality. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Jutland became a case study taught with near-religious intensity at Etajima. Every Japanese naval officer learned the lesson. Long-range gunnery could decide battles before ships even came into visual contact. But there was a subtle division in how Japan interpreted that lesson. The British response to Jutland was incremental. Better shells, refined fire control tables, improved optics, relentless crew training. Evolution, not revolution. Japan's response was ambitious: bigger guns, heavier armour, decisive firepower. If the British could hit at 20,000 yards, Japan would build guns that could devastate at 25,000 yards, and armour thick enough to shrug off anything that came back. Two philosophies, both logical, both born from the same battle, but only one would prove sustainable in the chaos of modern warfare. Tokyo Naval Intelligence Bureau, July 1940. The report arrived by telegraph from Rome, decoded, stamped urgent, and delivered to Admiral Yamamoto's desk within hours. Battle of Calabria, Mediterranean, July 9th. HMS Warspite, the same ship that had fought at Jutland, now 25 years old, engaged the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare. Range, 24,000 yards, 13 miles. The shell flight time was calculated at 29 seconds. At that distance, the Italian ship was barely visible on the horizon, a grey smudge against the afternoon haze. The chances of a hit were statistically negligible, 1 in 100, maybe less. Warspite fired, the shell landed, direct hit. Giulio Cesare's funnel erupted in smoke and flame. The Italian fleet turned away, breaking off the engagement. One shot, one hit. Battle over. The Japanese intelligence officer who translated the report circled the range in red ink 3 times. 24,000 yards, a record, the longest range naval gunnery hit ever recorded in combat. And it wasn't a fluke. Admiral Yamamoto read the report twice, then he called for the files on British capital ships currently in service. 5 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, all equipped with 15-inch guns, all upgraded with modern fire control systems, all operating in waters that might soon intersect with Japanese interests: the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, the approaches to Singapore. The guns were 28 years old, designed before the First World War, built in an era before radar, before advanced computing, before half the technologies that defined modern naval warfare, and they were still landing hits at ranges that defied probability. Yamamoto made a notation in the margin of the report. Assumption: extreme range equals safety. British guns challenged this assumption. Doctrine review required. The note was polite, cautious, the kind of bureaucratic language that masked deeper concerns. But in the hallways of the Naval General Staff, the whispers were less restrained. If they can hit at 13 miles, if they've upgraded the fire control, if we encounter them in restricted waters... The questions multiplied. The answers remained uncertain. By 1941, the Japanese Navy had studied every British naval engagement of the early war. Mers el-Kebir, Dakar, Taranto, Matapan. Again and again, British capital ships demonstrated the same unnerving capability. Long-range accuracy that shouldn't have been possible with guns designed in 1912. Japan's doctrine emphasized decisive engagements, closing to medium range, overwhelming the enemy with superior firepower and night-fighting tactics. It was a philosophy built on aggression, speed, and the element of surprise. But what if the enemy could hit you before you reached decisive range? What if the very concept of safe distance had become obsolete? The British hadn't built a wonder weapon. They'd built something more insidious, a weapon that aged gracefully, that improved quietly, that turned experience and incremental refinement into a persistent, nagging advantage. The Japanese respected this, but respect was hardening into something colder, something closer to unease. The kind of unease that comes from realizing your entire tactical framework might be built on an assumption that no longer holds true. Malacca Strait. Dawn, 1942. Lieutenant Saito's hands shook as he gripped the railing. The geysers had stopped, 5 columns of water, each one closer than the last, each one a message written in high explosive and seawater. The British battleship was still there, a faint outline on the southern horizon, patient and unhurried. His destroyer was alive only because the British gunners had chosen to let it live, or because they were still walking their shots inward, bracket by bracket, adjusting for the kill. The captain gave the order: hard turn, full speed, evasive course. The destroyer carved a white wake through the dark water, fleeing north toward the cover of coastal haze. Saito didn't lower his binoculars. He watched that distant shape until it disappeared behind the curve of the earth, and even then he kept watching, as if the horizon itself had become dangerous. He had studied Jutland. He had read the Calabria reports. He had seen the intelligence assessments marked extreme range capabilities confirmed. But knowing something and feeling it are not the same thing. Now he understood what those reports couldn't convey: the visceral helplessness of being under fire from a weapon you cannot answer, from a distance you cannot close, by an enemy you can barely see. Saito's encounter was not unique. Across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian waters, Japanese naval officers filed similar reports through 1942 and early 1943. Destroyer squadrons on patrol, submarine crews surfaced at dawn, reconnaissance cruisers probing British-held waters. All of them reported the same phenomenon: shell splashes appearing from impossible distances. A destroyer captain off Ceylon observed 4 near misses at estimated 18,000 yards. Shells appeared to arrive from extreme elevation, broke off engagement. A submarine commander in the Bay of Bengal surfaced at dawn, immediate bracketing from unseen capital ship. Crash dive. No damage sustained, but position compromised. A cruiser's log near the Andaman Islands. Heavy splashes observed at maximum visual range. Radar contact confirmed British battleship. Withdrew to safer waters per doctrine. The pattern was consistent. The British ships, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Warspite, Renown, operated with a bubble of control that extended far beyond what Japanese doctrine had planned for. The 15-inch gun had aged well because the British had never stopped improving the system around it. Radar fire control, introduced in 1941, allowed British gunners to track targets beyond visual range and calculate firing solutions with mechanical precision. Upgraded shells with improved aerodynamics extended effective range. New propellant formulations reduced barrel wear. Better optics, better rangefinders, better crew training. Layer upon layer of incremental advantage, compounding over decades. The gun itself was old, the system was modern, and that system turned a 1912 weapon into a 1942 nightmare. Japanese ships carried powerful guns, 14-inch, 16-inch, even the massive 18.1-inch guns of the Yamato class. On paper, they outmatched the British weapons, but paper doesn't account for fire control accuracy. It doesn't account for the consistency of shell performance. It doesn't account for the psychological weight of knowing the enemy can reach you before you can reach them. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Singapore, March 1942. The operations map showed British capital ship positions across the Indian Ocean. Red circles marked their suspected patrol zones. Each circle extended outward in gradual rings: visual range, effective gun range, extreme gun range. The extreme range circles overlapped shipping lanes, patrol routes, strategic choke points. Admiral Ozawa studied the map in silence. "Recommendations?" he asked. His staff officer spoke carefully. "Avoid engagement unless we have numerical superiority or air cover. Do not assume safety beyond 20,000 yards. Treat British capital ships as area denial weapons." Area denial. The term hung in the air. These were battleships, meant to be engaged, defeated, sunk in decisive surface actions. But the reality of modern warfare had turned them into something else. Floating zones of interdiction, their guns creating kill boxes measured in miles, forcing Japanese ships to reroute, hesitate, second-guess. The British didn't need to sink Japanese ships to win, they just needed to make Japanese commanders afraid of getting close. That fear was rational, justified, built on hard data and confirmed encounters. But it was also corrosive. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggressive action, decisive engagements, seizing the initiative. But how do you seize initiative when the enemy controls the range equation? How do you close for a decisive blow when every mile forward is a calculated risk against weapons that have been perfected over 30 years? Destroyer captains grew cautious. Submarine patrols adjusted their surfacing routines. Cruiser squadrons requested air reconnaissance before entering contested waters. The British 15-inch gun didn't just sink ships, it reshaped behaviour. Lieutenant Saito returned to port 3 days after his encounter in the Malacca Strait. He filed his report noting shell splash patterns, estimated range, and the time delay between muzzle flash and impact. At the bottom of the report, he added a single line. Unasked for, unprofessional, but honest. We cannot fight what we cannot reach. His commanding officer read the report, initialed it, and filed it away. But he didn't disagree. Portsmouth, England, 1946. HMS Warspite sat in harbour, battered and scarred. Her hull bore the marks of 6 years of war, dents from near misses, patches welded over shell damage, rust bleeding through grey paint. She had fought at Jutland in 1916. She had fired the longest-range hit in naval history at Calabria. She had bombarded Normandy beaches on D-Day. 31 years of service, 2 world wars, countless battles, and her 15-inch guns still worked. A naval engineer walked the deck that autumn morning, inspecting the barrels for the final time. The rifling was worn, but serviceable. The mechanism still cycled smoothly. Even after tens of thousands of shells, the weapons remained accurate enough for combat duty. He ran his hand along the cold steel and wondered how many enemy ships had seen these barrels on the horizon. How many captains had felt their confidence drain as the range closed, or failed to close, and the shells began to fall. The gun hadn't changed the world through revolution. It had changed the world through persistence. In the decades after World War II, naval historians began to ask a different question. Not why the 15-inch gun worked, but why it kept working when so many of its contemporaries had faded into obsolescence. The answer lay in philosophy. Other navies had chased scale, bigger guns, heavier shells, longer theoretical ranges. Japan's 18.1-inch guns on Yamato and Musashi were marvels of engineering, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Germany's 15-inch and 16-inch guns were powerful and modern, but scale without precision is just noise. The British had chosen a different path, incremental mastery. Build a good gun, then make it better. Improve the shells, refine the fire control, train the crews relentlessly. Update the systems around the weapon as technology evolved, but keep the core design stable, proven, reliable. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't make headlines, but it worked for 30 years, across 2 world wars, against every enemy the Royal Navy faced. Tokyo, 1950. Former Lieutenant Commander Saito, now a civilian working as a technical translator, sat in a quiet library reading a newly published history of British naval gunnery. He was 54 now, grey-haired, no longer the young officer who had stood on a destroyer bridge and felt his world turn inside out. He came to a chapter on the Queen Elizabeth class and the 15-inch gun. The author, a British admiral, wrote matter-of-factly about fire control systems, shell improvements, and crew training standards. Saito smiled faintly. The book didn't mention the terror. It didn't describe the psychological weight of being bracketed by shells from nowhere, the slow realization that all your training and doctrine had been built on assumptions that no longer held. But he remembered. He remembered the 35-second wait between flash and impact. He remembered the columns of water rising like monuments to British engineering. He remembered filing his report and knowing, even as he wrote it, that nothing would change, because you couldn't will your guns to shoot farther or your fire control systems to be more accurate. The British had spent decades building that advantage, shell by shell, upgrade by upgrade, training exercise by training exercise. Japan had tried to catch up in a handful of years. It hadn't been enough. The legacy of the BL 15-inch Mark I wasn't just in the battles it won, it was in the battles it prevented. Japanese destroyers that rerouted to avoid British capital ships, submarine patrols that stayed submerged longer than tactically ideal, cruiser squadrons that requested air reconnaissance before entering contested waters. Entire operational plans adjusted around the presence of aging British battleships carrying aging British guns, area denial, psychological control, strategic deterrence. The weapon had created a bubble of influence that extended far beyond its physical range, a zone where enemy commanders hesitated, calculated, and often chose retreat over engagement. That was the real genius of the design. Not the size, not the spectacle, but the reliability, the absolute certainty that if you came within range, the shells would find you. HMS Belfast, River Thames, London, present day. Tourists walk the deck of the preserved cruiser, reading plaques about World War II naval operations. Nearby in dry dock, other museum ships rest quietly, reminders of an era when naval guns decided the fate of empires. Some of those ships carried 15-inch guns. The barrels are still there, trained. Eternally toward empty horizons, silent now but still imposing. Visitors take photographs. Children climb on the turrets. Few understand what these weapons represented. Not just firepower, but a philosophy of warfare that valued precision over spectacle, incremental improvement over revolutionary leaps. An elderly Japanese man stands near one of the guns, his hand resting on the cold metal. He doesn't explain to his grandchildren why he's silent, why he stares at the barrel for so long, why his expression carries something between respect and old, remembered fear. He doesn't tell them about a morning in 1942, a dark sea, a distant flash, and 35 seconds of counting. Some memories don't need translation. Physical range can be measured in miles, calculated, plotted, reduced to numbers on a firing table. Psychological range is harder to quantify. It's the distance at which confidence turns to caution, the range at which doctrine confronts reality, the gap between what you thought was safe and what actually keeps you alive. The British BL 15-inch Mark I naval gun created both kinds of range, and across 2 world wars, across decades of technological change, it held that advantage, not through size or spectacle, but through the quiet, relentless competence of a weapon that simply refused to age. That's the kind of gun it was, the kind that made even the proudest navies ask, in voices edged with disbelief, "What kind of gun is that?"